On September 6, 2007, the world did not simply lose an opera singer. It lost a voice so vast that even people who had never stepped inside an opera house knew exactly who he was. When Luciano Pavarotti died in Modena at the age of 71, the news moved far beyond the borders of classical music. Television networks interrupted programming. Headlines spread across Europe, the Americas, Asia, and the Middle East. For decades, Pavarotti had done something almost impossible. He had taken an art form many people considered distant, elite, or intimidating, and turned it into something emotional, human, and unforgettable. So when the news broke, the silence that followed did not feel like the end of a career. It felt like the end of a sound the world had come to trust. In Italy, the grief was immediate and intimate. Modena, the city that had shaped him, became the center of mourning, but the reaction was global. Opera houses dimmed their lights. Fellow singers spoke with the tone people use when they know a category has just lost one of its final giants. Yet what made Pavarotti's death so different was that he had long since crossed beyond opera. He was not only the tenor of grand stages like La Scala or the Met. He was the smiling, larger-than-life figure who had filled stadiums, stood beside world stars, and helped millions hear Puccini, Verdi, and Donizetti without fear. He had become a cultural bridge, from theater to television, from classical music to the mass public, from Italy to the whole world. That is where the real story begins. How does the son of a baker from Modena become the voice that could stop crowds, silence arenas, and make opera feel universal? How does one man rise so high that his death leaves even non-opera listeners feeling that something irreplaceable has gone quiet? To understand why Luciano Pavarotti's death felt like the world had lost more than a singer, we have to go back before the global fame, before the three tenors, before the high Cs, before the standing ovations. We have to return to the boy in post-war Italy who had no reason to believe his voice would one day belong to the world.
Before the fame, before the applause, before the world learned to wait for that impossible high note, Luciano Pavarotti was simply a boy growing up in Modena, in northern Italy, in the long shadow of war. He was born in 1935 into a working-class family that did not possess luxury, but did possess warmth, discipline, and music. His father, Fernando, was a baker by trade, but opera lived inside him with the force of a second life. He loved singing, collected records, and filled the house with the sound of great voices. Luciano's mother, Adele, worked hard to keep the family grounded in practical survival. Their world was modest, especially in the difficult post-war years, but it was not empty. It was full of routine, labor, family closeness, and the idea that beauty could exist even where money did not. In that environment, the young Luciano did not yet look like destiny. He looked like a child from an ordinary home, surrounded by ordinary struggle, slowly absorbing something extraordinary through sound. As a boy, Pavarotti was not raised as a prodigy in the modern sense. There was no machine around him, no early myth, no sense that the world was waiting. But the voice was there, and so was the love of music. He sang in church, listened to his father's favorite tenors, and learned early that opera was not only about technique, it was about feeling, breath, and emotional force. At the same time, he also lived a life that felt very far from the glamour his future would later suggest. He played football, studied, dreamed in different directions, and even considered a normal profession. For a period, he worked as a schoolteacher, a reminder that his life could easily have taken a quieter path. That is part of what makes his story powerful. Greatness did not arrive as certainty. It arrived slowly, almost reluctantly, through encouragement, training, and the realization that his voice was not something he could keep ordinary forever. The turning point came as his natural gift began to meet discipline. Under vocal training and with the support of those who heard what he could become, Pavarotti started to understand that he possessed more than a pleasant. When Luciano Pavarotti finally stepped onto the professional operatic path, he did not arrive as a polished aristocrat from some grand musical dynasty. He arrived as a man from Modena carrying an unusually radiant instrument and the discipline to learn how not to waste it. Early success did not come overnight, but once the world of opera began to hear him clearly, the effect was immediate. His breakout came in the 1960s, and what distinguished him was not only power, but brightness, a tenor sound that seemed to rise effortlessly, opening rather than forcing. There are voices that impress professionals, and then there are voices that make even non-experts feel they have just heard something impossible. Pavarotti belonged to the second kind. Audiences responded not simply because he sang accurately, but because he made singing feel physically exhilarating. He didn't sound like a technician proving mastery. He sounded like joy amplified to cathedral scale. As the major roles came, so did the ascent. He sang Rodolfo in La Bohème, Tonio in La Fille du Régiment, the Duke in Rigoletto, and role after role that demanded beauty, stamina, style, and fearless projection. The great opera houses opened: Covent Garden, La Scala, the Metropolitan Opera. What happened there is important because this was not just the rise of another respected tenor. Pavarotti had something many great classical performers lack: instant recognizability. The smile, the beard, the handkerchief, the warmth, the visible pleasure of performance, all of it made him unusually accessible. He did not seem like someone guarding an elite tradition. He seemed like someone inviting the audience inside it. That changed everything. Opera had long been admired, feared, respected, and misunderstood by wider public audiences. Pavarotti helped remove the fear. He made the form feel human. You didn't need to understand Italian diction or bel canto history to understand what that voice was doing to a room. By the 1970s and 1980s, he was no longer only a star of the opera world. He had become one of its defining faces. The phrase, "King of the High Seas," followed him because of his astonishing command of the upper register, especially in works that turned technical challenge into dramatic ecstasy. But titles alone don't explain what happened. The deeper truth is that Pavarotti became a rare kind of ambassador, someone who carried an old art into a new media age without draining it of its dignity. Television appearances, interviews, recordings, and major broadcasts widened his reach far beyond the usual opera public. He did not water the music down. He made people come up toward it. Then came the real breaking point between opera and mass culture: the Three Tenors. When Pavarotti appeared alongside Placido Domingo and José Carreras in the famous 1990 concert ahead of the World Cup in Italy, the result was bigger than anyone in classical music had fully predicted. Suddenly, opera was not hidden in velvet seats and expensive halls. It was in stadiums, on televisions, in living rooms, across continents. People who had never knowingly listened to Puccini or Verdi were humming Nessun Dorma. And at the center of that phenomenon was Pavarotti, whose voice and presence translated prestige into popular emotion. He was not the only great tenor alive, but he became the tenor the world could immediately identify. That distinction matters. Greatness is one thing, cultural penetration is another. Pavarotti achieved both, yet the reason this part of his story matters is not only success, it is the way he changed the emotional geography of music. He made opera feel less like a distant institution and more like a living force that could belong to ordinary people. This was not accidental. His warmth, generosity of expression, and lack of visible snobbery made him a bridge figure between classical tradition and public feeling. In another life, he might have been remembered as a brilliant specialist adored by opera lovers. In this life, he became something far rarer, a global phenomenon whose voice could stop a stadium the way it once stopped a theater. And that is the moment when Luciano Pavarotti ceased to be only a singer. He became an event, a symbol, a threshold. He did not merely succeed inside opera, he broke its wall. And once a voice crosses that wall, it carries a new burden, because from then on it no longer belongs only to the stage, it belongs to the world.
By the time Luciano Pavarotti became one of the most recognized musicians on earth, the voice that had once felt like pure gift had also become obligation. Fame at that scale changes the meaning of performance. Every appearance is no longer simply a concert, it becomes proof that the legend is still intact. Audiences do not come only to hear music, they come to confirm that the miracle is still real. For Pavarotti, this meant carrying not just opera, but expectation itself. The public saw the smile, the handkerchief, the warmth, the ease. What it often did not see was the pressure beneath that image, the discipline required to protect the voice, the relentless travel, the physical demand of projecting greatness night after night, and the impossible standards set by his own success. Once the world decides you are the voice of an art form, even an ordinary performance can feel like failure. And then there was the human life behind the giant sound. Pavarotti's public image was joyful, generous, almost larger than gravity itself, but private life was more complicated. Fame brought scrutiny, family tensions, relationship changes, and the kind of media attention that turns ordinary human weaknesses into public theater. He was adored, but also watched, celebrated, but also judged. The same openness that made him beloved could make him vulnerable. Over the years, his career became not only a story about singing, but a story about how a man lives while carrying the weight of being constantly recognized as singular. Unlike some stars who became cold or unreachable, Pavarotti remained emotionally legible to the public. That warmth protected him in many ways, but it also meant people felt entitled to more of him. More access, more charm, more triumph, more reassurance that the great tenor was still standing exactly where they needed him to be. But bodies are not built to remain legendary forever. As the years passed, the strain became harder to hide. Age, health complications, and the natural erosion that comes with a life of immense physical performance began to slow him down. Even when the voice still carried beauty, the body increasingly showed the cost. The world was seeing not only a master musician aging, but an icon gradually being claimed by time. There is a specific sadness in watching someone whose gift once seemed superhuman become visibly mortal. Yet that sadness is also what deepened the emotional force of Pavarotti's later years. He no longer represented only triumph. He represented endurance, the effort to keep giving beauty while the instrument itself becomes more fragile. And that is where this chapter turns darker. Because once the body starts to lose its argument with time, the final act is no longer about career. It becomes about how a legend meets decline and whether the world can bear to watch. In the final stretch of Luciano Pavarotti's life, the world was forced to confront something it had never wanted to imagine: that the voice which once seemed larger than opera itself could one day fall silent. By the mid-2000s, his public appearances had already begun to carry a different emotional weight. He was still unmistakably Pavarotti, still warm, still smiling, still able to command attention the moment he entered a room, but the body no longer moved with the same ease. Age had already slowed him, and then illness changed the story completely. In 2006, Pavarotti was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Surgeries followed. Concert plans collapsed. The farewell tour that had been intended as a grand closing chapter instead became something sadder and more fragile. A world gradually realizing that the ending would not unfold on stage under perfect lights, but in private struggle, hospital corridors, and the slow narrowing of time. For a man who had spent decades turning breath into triumph, the cruelest fact was that breath itself was becoming harder to trust. And yet, even in decline, the symbolic power of his presence remained enormous. News updates from Modena carried far beyond Italy. Fans watched closely, hoping for recovery, searching each new photograph for signs of strength. The media covered his treatment not only because he was a celebrity, but because he represented something almost sacred in music. The idea that beauty could arrive through the human body and make people feel briefly larger than themselves. As his condition worsened, tributes began before death had even come, the way they often do when the world senses it is beginning to lose a giant. What made the mood around Pavarotti's final illness especially painful was that he had never seemed distant from ordinary people. He was not a cold monument. He was human, emotional, generous, visibly delighted by singing, visibly delighted by being loved. That made the decline harder to watch. It was not simply the weakening of a star, it was the visible dimming of a source of joy. On September 6, 2007, Luciano Pavarotti died at home in Modena, surrounded by family. He was 71 years old. The reaction was immediate and deeply felt. Italy mourned him as a national treasure, but the grief traveled far beyond the country that had given him birth. Political leaders, opera houses, fellow musicians, and millions of listeners across the world paid tribute. His funeral at Modena Cathedral drew enormous attention, not because people were only honoring a career, but because they understood that an era was ending. In death, as in life, Pavarotti filled space. The image of crowds gathered outside, of music and mourning merging in his hometown, carried the same emotional truth his singing had always carried. Grandeur does not erase humanity. It reveals it. And that is why his final chapter continues to resonate. Luciano Pavarotti did not leave behind only recordings, awards, and applause. He left behind the memory of a voice that once made opera feel universal, and of a silence that proved how rare that voice had been. The man died. The voice did not.